together.
No, if he leans in, he can be seen. He just doesn't want to.
Oh, okay, that's better. Got it. Perfect, just checking.
Natalie, I'm colorblind. Is that green behind you?
Green, yeah.
Well, it looks
Like
orange.
reeds, like the sea of reeds.
It looks orange to me. So. Now, I hope the lawnmower doesn't come.
You're out of this world, Alan.
Thank you. People think I should be on the stage. The stage going to Salt Lake City. Oh, you're a good audience.
It is now noon. It's noon 01, 12:01. So I think we should get rocking and rolling. We've got lots to learn together today. So we'll start, as always, with our blessing for Torah study, thanking God for the opportunity and sometimes the push to engage with Torah, that is such a rich part of our tradition. So we say, Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So believe it or not, Passover's around the corner. I don't quite know how that happened. I don't know if anybody else is shocked by it. I am. But we are close enough to Passover that's what we're talking about this morning, this afternoon, whatever time it is. It's so gray out. It's just sort of ambiguous time today. We're going to talk about Passover, and the specific piece of Passover that we're going to look at. Does anybody know the custom about a Seder all night? People heard this, right? You do a Seder all night long. We're going to look at where that comes from and what our different commentators have to say about it. So we can then decide, we'll make our own choices about how long our Seder is going to go, right? If you don't have a premium Zoom account, your Seder is going to go 45 minutes and then cut you right off. Another niche piece of knowledge we just learned. We were just talking about the knowledge we've acquired that we didn't necessarily want to or ever expect to this year. So that's what we're going to look at. I'm going to pull up a sheet for us. And one of the cool things, I think cool to me, I hope it's cool to someone else as well, really different kinds of commentary that I've pulled for us this afternoon, different kinds of stuff. So I'm going to put my screen up and I will make it bigger, I promise. I know I never make it big enough. How's that for size?
Pretty good.
All right. I'm trying. I try and learn, right? This is all of our goals. We try and learn as we go. So this is a piece from the traditional Haggadah. So Haggadah is our Passover prayer book. This is the traditional text. So Haggadot, which is the plural, have taken so many incredible turns. I collect them because I think they're beautiful. I love Passover. It's a secret. Passover is my favorite holiday of the entire year. I absolutely love it. I live for Passover. So I have all different kinds of Haggadot that I love to collect. The Reform movement actually just came out with a brand new one this year that's sitting right here. That if you look, it matches our prayer book and it matches our Machzor, the High Holy Day prayer book that we have. And the pages look a lot like our prayer book. It's beautiful. It just came out. Was released a couple weeks ago. It's a really beautiful resource. There's so many beautiful Haggadot, and our tradition is so rich with different kinds of texts. We're going to base off of the sort of traditional standard Ashkenazi text is what we're going to look at for the source of this practice of an all-night Seder. So this is from the traditional text. It's from the Magid section. Magid is story. Magid and Haggadah are the same root. It's the same Hebrew root. It's for telling the story. So this is going to be our text in question. Is there someone who might like to read it for us?
I'll read.
Go
It
ahead.
happened once on Pesach that Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yehoshua, and Rabbi Eliezer ben Azura, Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Tarfon were reclining in the Bnei Brak. They were telling stories of the Exodus from Egypt that whole night, while their students came and said to them, "The time of reciting the morning Shema has arrived." Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah said, "Behold, I am like the men of 70 years. I am not merited to understand why the exodus from Egypt should be said at night until Ben Zoma explicated it, as it is stated in Deuteronomy 16:3. In order that you remember the day of your going out from the land of Egypt and all your days of your life. The days of your life indicate that the remembrance be involved during the days. All the days of your life indicates that the remembrance be invoked also during the nights. But the sages say the days of your life indicate the remembrance be invoked in this world. All the days of your life indicated that the remembrance be invoked also in the days of the Messiah."
Thank you for reading, Jenna. It wasn't easy. It's a tough passage to read. You did great. Lots of names. And so the brackets, just for clarity, the brackets have been added. I pulled this translation from Sefaria. A lot of what's on Sefaria at this point in their project lifespan is very good. And one of the things I like is that they add these brackets that aren't what the words technically say, but are implied and help us understand. So what's happening here? Can anybody sort of recap what we're discussing?
Telling the story of the Exodus.
Telling the story. Mark, yeah. Thank you, Jerry.
All night.
So,
Wait, start again.
what?
Mark and then Margie.
I wasn't unmuted.
Oh, this is the traditional Haggadah as Maxwell House ever made. Except for the last sentence, it just talks about whether you should. I've got an echo here, so.
You do?
You turn the volume off on one of your screens.
Yeah. Okay.
So turn
We
the
did that.
volume off on one of your devices and only have sound coming through on one.
Is that better? It's
We
delayed.
don't have an echo on you.
Okay. So the rabbis were discussing whether the statement in the Haggadah to include all the days of your life or just the nights of your life, and when they recite the Haggadah. And the last part of this talked about the world to come, which I've never seen in a Haggadah before.
So it's not often so explicit. And what's the last thing we have in the Haggadah?
Last glass of wine.
So beyond that, the last sentence we say,
Next year, Jerusalem.
next year in Jerusalem, B'shana haba'ad b'Yerushalayim. The implied piece of that is next year in Jerusalem at the third temple, the coming of the Messiah. There are messianic implications of that line. We have sort of, in a lot of Reform progressive spaces, left those behind a little bit. But that's where it does originally relate to, is a little bit of a messianic idea there. Margie, did you have something to add?
I was just going to note that the students brought up a conflict between, I guess, the the benefit of having an all-night Seder versus saying the Shema at the right time in the morning. And it sounds as if the Seder won. The all-night Seder won.
Yeah. One of the things that's interesting, right? So the story goes, all these rabbis are, oh, it's my internet. Do you have me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
We hear you.
Sinai is struggling. We're going to see how this goes. So the story starts, right, that these rabbis are reclining in Bnei Brak. Bnei Brak is still a neighborhood of Jerusalem. It's a religious neighborhood. They're reclining. They're leaning back, telling the story the whole night. And then their students come and say to them, it's time to say the Shema. What is there? Does anything stick out as a problem there, or a question you might have in that story about the students?
Why
But the
weren't the
students
students
were with
involved
them.
in the all night?
Why weren't they there? Right? Let me see if I can switch my internet. Hold on. Let's see. One sec. Do I have everybody?
Yep.
Yeah,
Okay.
you've been coming through without delays.
Oh, strange.
Yeah, you're fine.
You're all delayed for me, and it's giving me an internet alert. Okay, so we're gonna keep on rolling. As long as you can hear me, I will figure out what you're saying. So where were the students? If we think about practice of that time, right? Students, the idea is either metaphorically or sometimes quite literally sit at the feet of the rabbis, right? They sit at their feet to learn from them. Why weren't they there? Kind of a strange one. It's a question we might start to pick up. This is one of the things that we work on as we become more confident in our text abilities, right? The goal is to read a text and say, what are the things I could point out as question marks? I won't say problematic, won't go that far, but what are question marks I could identify? That's how we end up with commentary, because that's what the rabbis do. They go through and they say, here's a question mark and here's a question mark, and this doesn't feel so answered to me. I'm gonna move around our sheet here for a second because I want to go to, I'll make it bigger. I've got a lot of stuff in here. I couldn't help myself. Okay, so here's a piece. Hold on. Here's a piece from a rabbi in New York that I just thought it was a good piece of commentary. So he says, many questions have arisen about this snippet of text. What were these rabbis doing in Bnei Brak, which was the hometown of Rabbi Akiva only? Saying, what were these other guys doing there? Why didn't their students join them in celebrating the Seder? Why didn't the rabbis themselves notice the rising of the sun? Right? So why did the students have to come? These are very good questions. He should be a rabbi, right? Good question. Then context is everything. This story takes place during the rule of the Roman Emperor Hadrian, who ordered that the temple be moved so he could put a temple to Jupiter on the Temple Mount. In the year 123 of the Common Era, a guerrilla insurgency began, which resulted in a crackdown by the Roman authorities. Bnei Brak was the headquarters of the rebellion against Roman occupation, a rebellion of which Rabbi Akiva was a leader. Because of rebel activities, the Roman authorities had forbidden gatherings of Jews on pain of death. The Seder described in this passage was used not only as a chance to discuss the liberation from Egypt, but also to plan a strategy of resistance against Roman occupation. The students were standing guard, ready to caution the rabbis to disband at daybreak, lest they be caught. This tale may be read as an encouragement to become so joyfully immersed in the Seder that we don't notice the passing of time. And it may also be read as a story of how one liberation begets another. Celebrating our freedom from servitude can be a radical act. It was Rabbi Akiva, after all, who famously answered the query, which is better, study or action? With the response, study if it leads to action. Thoughts on this contextualization?
I think that explains the question.
Pretty good, huh?
Yeah.
How often does everybody sit there and they're like, oh, I saw a bunch of you nodding as we read. Huh, that works for me, right? Okay, right? It's doing a decent job. It makes a lot of sense. This is why historical context can be so powerful, because doesn't that change how you feel? For me, changes how I feel about the Seder tradition, about the tradition to go late in the night, but also about Seders in general, right? Look at the context of this Seder that they were hosting and this experience that they were having, that they were looking, the idea that we should become so wrapped up in the joy of the experience that we lose our sense of time. What a gift that would be, especially now, right? That everybody, I mean, it's become a popular joke, right? That no one knows what day it is, right? We've lost some sense of time in the last year. But what if we lost our sense of time for a really wonderful reason, not because of monotony? We lost our sense of time because we're so wrapped up in it, right? Call it the time loop, Julia. Yeah, right? It's the idea that what time flies when you're having fun, but really to lean into that. Alan, was that a hand?
Yes. What what's the disposition of interrupting the Seder to recite the Shema? Is that a question we should ask?
It's a really interesting question. I haven't pulled commentary on that today, but it is a question. There's all kinds of debate. I mean, we debate everything, right? The rabbis have discussion about everything, especially time. The rabbis are very into time and how we mark time. So actually, this is sort of a unique departure, that we have this example of some of our great sages who aren't so bound by time. They weren't focused on the time. We're so hyper-focused on timing, and this many stars indicates night, and we say this at this time, and we have so much ink on the timing of the Shema in particular, right? We have so much debate about, okay, at what point in the day are you too late to say your morning prayers, right? Well, what point have you missed that chance?
The first chapters of Barachot and the Talmud go deeply into all of that.
It sure does. They sure do. So this is actually, I mean, it's great that you brought that sort of question up, because while it's not this question, looking at the amount of rabbinic focus on that question can tell us about this, right? It's fascinating that our rabbis are so focused on timing, right? Timing of the Shema and all of this. And here they aren't. They're really focused on this Passover story. They're focused on this story of the Exodus from Egypt, so much so that they didn't even notice it was time for the Shema. They didn't even know. There is a debate, Alan, about if you can interrupt for the Shema, right? Or there's debate about, can the Seder go too long, right? At what point have you taken it too far and you're going to interfere with morning prayers? Some people believe that's the line, right? That a Seder has to stop when it's time to say Shachari, when it's time to say the morning prayers. There's lots of ink spilled on that, 100%. But it so sits with me that these time-centric beings are willing to go get lost in time. It's almost like, for me, it's like almost as sort of romanticized as these rabbis get, right? They're really practical guys. They're practical guys. They don't sort of lean into getting, the idea of getting lost in a good book. That would be, I think, abhorrent to them, right? That you could lose yourself in something, that you wouldn't be regimented enough, that you wouldn't be, studying, that it wouldn't be prescribed, that you wouldn't be in this order, that you wouldn't be bound by the times. And here they lost themselves. So what's different? What's unique about the Passover story? That it's what to get lost in. Yeah, Lori.
Well, I was just going to ask the feeling about transcendence as a concept in general.
Was very dramatic. Wasn't it?
Sorry.
No, it was very dramatic. I loved it.
How did take your earplug out? Is there any, Judaism likes to stay in the real world and concern itself with reality. Is there
until you get into
a
mysticism,
negativity about transcendence? Because that's what the rabbis were experiencing.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can certainly make the argument that they had a transcendent experience. These are the practical rabbis, the rabbis of our mystical tradition of Kabbalah and the Zohar and the rabbis of Sfat. They were not so bound by the practical, right? Anybody who's read anything from Kabbalah knows that they weren't, sitting at the same table as the rabbis writing the Talmud. They were drinking a different Kool-Aid. Because it's just mystical, but it's out there, and it pushes you and requires your brain to think in a different way. I always tell Intro to Judaism students before the Intro to Kabbalah class, you're either going to walk out, because half of them walk out and say, whoa, that was so cool. Wow. And half of them walk out and say, whoa, I didn't get that. What's wrong with me? Right? Your brain either works that way or it doesn't. That's why I tell them all. My brain doesn't work that way. I struggled through the Kabbalah class I took in rabbinical school. And I think I've shared this story before, but I literally made the professor sit with me after about half of the classes. And he'd start I'd have him read you the lecture and he'd start a sentence and say, no, go back like 7 words. Explain that. Okay, 4 more words I can take at a time. And piece by piece, because it's not how my brain works, right? You either are sort of able to enter, it's like, can you meditate, or are you not someone who can meditate? I think it's sort of similar propensities. You either work that way or you don't. And so for sure, could they have been having some kind of transcendent experience? Yes. And these are not the rabbis who would have probably leaned into that kind of idea of transcendence. Julia, I see your hand.
I was just going to ask about if the rabbis, because this is such an important part of Jewish practice, these doing the Seder, if they kind of, it was elevated in such a way that the doing away with the concepts of time was kind of allowed, like they gave themselves an out on that one, maybe, because these are the guys, right? These are, if these guys are letting this happen, there's a reason, because they're not the types to just, let it all go. Like, these are the people that talk about Aruvs and,
Yeah, they're
like
not
nitty gritty details. We're in Pesachim right now for Daf Yomi, and they're like, who can eat the Paschal lamb and who can't? Do we bless the Kiddush twice? And like, these are these guys, right? And so if they're losing time, I feel like it's because they think it's important.
Absolutely. I'm with you. I think that there has to be something of value, perhaps even we can go as far as to say something unique about this story and rooting ourselves in it. And we do talk about Passover in a way we don't talk about other holidays. Like, so the big thing of Passover, we say you should feel as you yourself was saved from slavery, were taken out of Egypt. You personally, right? You, Julia, should feel like you, Julia Brucker, were taken out of Egypt. And so we don't talk about other stories that way. We just celebrated Purim, right? We don't say you should feel like one of the Jews of Shushan who was saved, right? We don't talk about any other holiday. We don't talk about Hanukkah, right? That you should feel like it was you yourself who well, it depends which Hanukkah story we want to tell, right? If we want to tell the cutesy one, or we want to tell the military one. But we don't with other holidays try to put ourselves in it in the same way. It's one of the unique things about Passover. And the other unique thing about Passover, we're really focused on passing it on to our children. There's a lot of focus with Passover on education, intergenerational education, but on education in a way that, of course, we're always focused on learning, but it's not the same way that we are with Passover. It's really important to us that our kids get this and that people feel a personal, involved connection to Passover.
Rabbi, that's what I've been wondering. I'm going back to those questions. The rabbis were gathered there, but this does not sound like a family celebration. I don't know. My contextual conceptualization of this is that in B'nai Barak, Rabbi Akiva happened to have a windowless room. So they could all meet there, and the Romans couldn't tell what they were doing in that back room of the house. And that's why they didn't notice that it was morning.
Yeah, there absolutely. I mean, this is no family celebration as it stands in this story. And we actually want to pull up one of our commentaries briefly talks about that. So I have commentaries in here that we'll get to some and we won't get to others. It depends on where our conversation goes, but I would always rather put more pieces here for us to have access to if we want them. And so here's a commentary, 1800s commentary from Morocco. And so it says this entire gathering was made up of great let me make it bigger, sorry. This entire gathering was made up of great sages without women or children present, from whom no sublime meanings of Torah were kept. We know that there could not have been women or children present because the Haggadah tells us that sages stayed up all night and drank 4 cups of wine, something the women or children were unable to do. They haven't met some of the women in my family who can definitely take down those 4 cups of wine. They should stick around, but okay, so the women can't do 4 cups of wine. Even though they knew the story of the Exodus quite well, they were obligated to stay up all night reviewing and discussing the story. While sages connected the repetition of the questions and answers in the Torah regarding the Exodus with the 4 children, the general lesson we learned from this repetition is that it's impossible to repeat the story of the Exodus without learning something new and different from one another. A person should not only repeat that which he already knew based on his own, but should learn new lessons and insights from others. The Haggadah goes on to give an example of this incident of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. So what are they, which this is sort of an offshoot of what you said, Fern, but it brought me there because of this women and children idea. Fun. Julia says, we try to make it really fun and engaging so kids will enjoy it. Absolutely. Margie said, it's our master story and main source of our identity. Yes. Marshall says, the story of Passover encompasses the whole Jewish nation, while Purim and Hanukkah was not all encompassing. Of a great distinction, right? This is all of the Jewish people as opposed to some of the Jewish people in one place. A great distinction, Marshall. I love what this commentary is saying, because why does it say that they did this all night, right? If they were going with this story all night, the story's not that long. It's not that long of a story. So they had to have been repeating it over and over and over again. And why? What does this Moroccan commentary say?
So they could learn from one another because they get new perspectives.
So they could learn from one another, you get new perspectives, right? So our learning, and we are a people who values group learning, right? Chavruta study is partnered study. Why? Because you learn something different when you see it through someone else's eyes. This is why we study together. Studying alone, not such a Jewish thing. We don't do that quite as much. Sure, do we prepare on our own? And if I'm going into Chavruta study, do I prepare on my own? So I go in with some thoughts? For sure. But we recognize that we do our best learning when we do it with other people. So not only am I going to learn from others if I study it with them, but what's the value of doing it over and over again with other people? Yeah. Margie, yeah.
Yes, is there also, I don't know, some text somewhere that says that it's a mitzvah to embellish the Seder, at the Seder, which would make the longer you could do it if it was a context test.
For sure. So, I mean, we could start any sentence with, there's probably a text somewhere that says something, right? If we look hard enough, I'm sure it's there. I don't know the specific text you're thinking about, but it is one of our ideas of Passover. We want to build and build it and build it. Why? Partly part of what Julia said, right? If we're trying to teach this to our children, the more exciting it can get and the bigger it can get, the more it's going to stand out, right? So if you tell the story and say, well, the Jews were slaves and they didn't want to be slaves anymore. And so God said, okay, I'll help. And they were rescued and they were free. That's not a great story. It's not getting me out of bed. I'm not getting worked up about that story. I'm not getting pumped, right? I'm not going to value that story in the same kind of way to carry it on through generations of my family. That's not what gets me excited. And so embellishing or maybe embellishing to me always feels like
it's not true.
Yeah, I mean, we joke. So here, the joke in my family, I'll let you in on the big family joke. My dad, my parents live on the water on Cape Cod in Massachusetts, and they're boat people. And my dad always insists that people need to be rescued. He's big on rescues, whether or not there's a rescue that's needed, right? So he sees someone strapping a boat, and he's very handy, and he can build engines, and he's always helping everyone on the river. All kinds of things show up on their dock, like a bottle of wine, because he's helped everybody. So we always would joke, especially when we were kids, that he'd go over, someone was having a problem with a boat, he'd go over, he'd help them, and they'd go on their way. Not a crazy story. By the end of the day, there would have been a pregnant woman on the verge of giving birth. There would have been a screaming child. Someone was bleeding from the head, right? Because this story would get so big. That is sort of how I see embellishing. And I don't know that that's what we do with Passover, because I don't think we're creating things. I think we are putting an immense amount of energy into making sure we do it justice, right? That we give all of the kavod, all of the honor, all of the excitement that is inherently there to be found in this story. And does that mean we sometimes add to it and expand, right? And add, we don't have all these little tiny details that make a story good, but we could reasonably read them onto a story. And absolutely we do that with Passover. Has anybody seen Prince of Egypt, seen the Disney movie? Oh my goodness. Well, you need to watch it. This is a pre-Passover mandatory event. I watch it multiple times a year, not just before Passover, because I love it. And it's actually, I think it's pretty well done within the context of the story. And so do they add, depth of character and relationship? For sure. And I think the story is done, hi Margie. I think the story is done really, really well. Including that they sing Hebrew in this Disney movie, which is like the most exciting for a Jewish kid, right? That you turn on a Disney movie and they're singing in Hebrew, singing Torah. They're singing Shirat Hayam, which we read a few weeks ago when we were reading Bishalach, which was our portion a couple weeks ago. They sing Torah in a Disney movie. But so that is a story that we have expanded on, but are still doing reasonable justice to it. So for sure. Okay, what's in the chat? This justifies my recent purchase of the Harry Potter Haggadah. Totally justifies it, Julia. I have so many different Haggadot I'm looking at my shelf over there. And all of them tell a slightly different version of this story. It's shifted, right? Based on the lens it wants to share it through.
Jordy, I have a question.
Go for it.
So do you think they stopped their story to say the Shema?
So this is a question, right? Did they stop when it was time to say the Shema? I think there are a couple outcomes. One, the students come in, they say, the time of reciting the morning Shema has come. And so you're done with the Passover Seder, you say the Shema. Scenario A. Scenario B, students say it's time for the Shema, and the rabbis say, buzz off, we're not done. Scenario C is they say, okay, we say the Shema, and then they go back to the story. I think most likely is option A, right? That this was the indicator, and there's debate about this, but the most sort of accepted would be that it's option A, that they come and say, now it's time to move on, because otherwise you're just going to say that story on loop. If there's no stopping point, when do you stop? There has to be an endpoint to saying the Passover story over and over again. And so this is how the endpoint is determined, right? Is by Shema in the morning. That you have to be. Yeah.
To back up a little bit, I think the reason that it says we should all envision ourselves as being in the Exodus is because if Passover didn't happen, we'd all still be slaves in Egypt.
For sure. I mean, that's what I would hope that something would have happened between, there and here, right? That something else could have happened to stop that slavery. But absolutely, it's part of, we're supposed to each feel that personal gratitude for the freedoms in our lives. Yeah, Arnold.
Just sitting here wondering, I mean, this was obviously a foundation moment in the whole concept of the Jewish nation. I was wondering, we've just lived through a Holocaust and then the creation of the state of Israel. Do you think someday there's going to be the equivalent to teach, like right now, I think to teach my kids what happened, in Germany, probably more touching base than going back to slavery in Egypt. You see what I mean? I mean, from a reality sense.
Yeah.
But I'm just curious. I mean, what do people anticipate? How will this era be remembered? Will it be a Seder? Will it be a thing? Yeah.
That's a fascinating question. I don't know. Does anybody have thoughts they want to offer? I think, let me reframe so we're all on the same page and make sure I heard you correctly. Questioning, right? Given this was a huge moment in Jewish history, and it was very long ago. We have these other mega major moments in Jewish history that are within the last 100 years. And so how will we, as a future Jewish community and civilization, respond and mark these big moments that happened much more recently? Is that the...
Fantastic. You can rewrite any one of my questions anytime you want.
Mark, yeah, I saw your hand.
Well, I think that there's more emphasis now on making Judaism not the bastard son of the Holocaust, as there was in making the Seder being the nation, creating the nation, because the Orthodox people especially are afraid that that the current generations are only going to be Jewish because we lived through the Holocaust, or our parents did. And I think that's important, that there was one that made a nation and one that just almost destroyed a nation.
Interesting. Other thoughts?
Well, we don't have the panel of rabbis like we did at the time of the Talmud being written, when they're debating how we do all these things, that destruction of the temple. And so it's more democratic in a way, how we remember things. It seems to vary from community to community, honestly, with the more contemporary stuff, like how we do, like even just Israeli Independence Day or Yom HaTzot, or Yom HaShoah. It's different everywhere. So I'm curious to see, but I don't think it'll be centralized.
I think that's an interesting point. And one of the things I'm thinking about is when I was an undergrad, I did a small scale study about the impacts of Holocaust education on my generation. So we were all, in our early 20s at that point in time. So I did a small scale study on this. And one of the things I walked away with was that we, as a collective American Jewish community, have instilled this narrative that we have Israel because of the Holocaust. That was the linkage that came through very clearly in these interviews. And some people were empowered by that, and some were really bothered by it and frustrated by it, but that we had created such a distinct correlation. Holocaust, Israel, which isn't based in history and reality, right? We know that we were in progress for a Jewish state much, much before the Holocaust. Was a Holocaust a piece of the puzzle? Absolutely, but there were lots of pieces to the puzzle. It wasn't a one-piece puzzle, right? It wasn't this direct shift. And so I think we had I think there have been a lot of missteps in the way we've educated sort of the generations who would start to have these remembrances and these markings. There have been missteps in how we've educated about what the Holocaust impacted about Jewish future moving forward. That I do think will impact how we relate to it as we move on. But that I carry that with me all the time. I mean, I did this study many years ago, and it was small scale for sure, and not a mega study, but in the small scale study, the data was pretty conclusive that was what they felt they had learned through their Jewish education. Holocaust, Israel, and I think that changes how you mark it.
I think, Rabbi, probably most of us here have incorporated other things into our Seder. We don't just read the Haggadah, we read other things as well that relate to freedom, oppression, and teach it that way.
Absolutely. The Seder, truly Passover is my favorite holiday, and partly it's because of how it was celebrated in my parents' home. So we grew up, and they started with it was UAHC, not URJ yet, a Union of American Hebrew Congregations, the Reform movement. It was started with sort of their old children's Haggadah, and it expanded and expanded and expanded and became, there are these binders now that they've got photocopies that start from there. And there's so many pieces that have been added over the years that it's such a mishmash of different things. And there are all different kinds of modern connections. And every year, my dad leads that Seder. And when I became a rabbi, he said, "Do you want to lead this?" I said, "No, I certainly don't. This is your Seder. Like, this is your Seder. If people are too drunk to do certain parts, I'm happy to help, but this is your Seder." So he added, and every year he adds something that feels sort of modern and relevant to that moment, which I do. I think it's a beautiful way to honor what it is to celebrate Passover, right? That we look at this story to tell the story, and for each of us to feel like we personally were there. How much easier would that be if we made personal relationships to it and personal connections to the story based on what's relevant in our lives, and we take these themes and extrapolate them out? So if I want to feel like I was there being saved at the Red Sea, how could I tap into a feeling that I have in my world that might help me start to imagine what that might have been like, right? Because we weren't there, which isn't surprising to anyone. We weren't there, right? We didn't feel the stress of, we talk about the sea splitting as though it happened immediately. It didn't happen immediately. We have this man called Nachshon ben Aminadav who walked into the water to his chin before it split. He walked into his chin, and some of us studied that in our women's group, but he walked all the way up to here as everybody watched. So add that to the scene of what that must have felt like. That's why we have a saying, I guess, that we say, you're the nachshon. A nachshon is a scapegoat or is a guinea pig, right? To try something. That's where it comes from, about being the nachshon, to walk up to your chin. Someone's got to do it. And he had to walk all the way up there and have this real show of faith, right? As it all seems like it might be lost before the sea splits. Adds to the drama of that moment and what it feels like. And so how could we tap into experiences that we know what they feel like to begin to build out what it might have felt like to be there? If that's what the commandment is to feel that. Yeah, Arnie, go.
Yeah, I guess I started something a long time ago, and I'm not sure, listening to this, I've always used the time as the kids were of the right age to talk about other events in Judaism, because, this is fine, but I also got to remind them, state of Israel creation, let's face it, that's almost as old. Well, it starts from the destruction of the Second Temple. You know what I mean? So why not talk about this now? I'm a Zionist, obviously, but why not talk about it? Why not talk about what the diaspora was all about? How come there are Jews all over the place? Stuff like that. So I don't know. I've always incorporated that in. And even what's happening with Israel now, I associate the Israel as part of the mass Jewish people. But what's happening now? So I don't know. I've kind of centering purely on the story of Haggadahs. When they're young, it's great. As they get older, then you can play with those four people, the four sons asking. That's kind of interesting psychology, But I got to admit that now, as they've gotten, older, of course, I'm starting to have a whole new generation, but, as they gotten old, even back then, I talked about the whole thing. And that's what we discussed. And it was great. I don't know if I was doing something right or wrong. But guys might try it. It's interesting.
Absolutely. Barb, I see your hand down there.
Yeah. I think this past year is a perfect place to start the discussion of Passover. It is so real to all of us, and to use this concept of not having rights, and being forced to do things and what have you. I think that this past year is a perfect segue into Passover.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we look at, these rabbis, they told the story all night long. Why? Because they were going to see something different in each telling, right? If you're going to repeat something over and over again, it's going to get really boring if you aren't looking at it differently.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
we have an expression that there are shivim panim l'Torah. There are 70 faces of the Torah. And excuse me, the Torah, you can see more faces as you turn it, right? You turn it and you turn it and you turn it and you see something different every time. This is why, we study the same Torah portions every year. Every year, it's the same thing. It doesn't change.
Yeah.
If you're waiting for it to change, stop waiting. It's not coming, right? Excuse me, I'm candy by now. We tell the same story over and over and over again. And our hope is that we hear it differently each time. We, for those of us who studied prayer together, we talked about this. We say the same prayers over and over and over again. Our hope is that they might feel different sometimes, right? Otherwise it becomes monotonous. We repeat, we value repetition in Judaism. We put immense value on it. Look at how much we repeat all the time. We repeat things to get something different out of them. And what you're all saying is how we find something different, right? That when you look at it again, all right, I read it, I heard the story for what it was.
With respect to COVID, we don't appreciate what we had when we don't have it. And, we have some things, but I'm appreciating things pre-COVID.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm going to pull up. There's a commentary in here that I really love. It's short. Comes from Ukraine. It says, the fact that the sages in Bnei Brak, it's talking about these 5 guys who sat all night. 5 guys. That's kind of funny. Five Guys, the burger place. Sounded funny out of my mouth. Sitting there eating fries. Very good French fries. The fact that the sages in B'nai Brak spent so much time retelling the story of the Exodus, when this story could simply be told in an hour or two, that's quite a telling. An hour or two is proof that they were delving into the implications of the story. As we have seen in the commentary above, the sages studied each of God's acts of kindness to understand how these acts have influenced not only generation that went forth from Egypt, but all future generations as well. This story then is a proof text for the final statement in the prior paragraph that anyone who spends time at length reviewing the story of Exodus is praiseworthy. So what's this commentary? What are they saying?
Tell it as long as you can.
And they've merited goodness. This is the favorable behavior, is to tell it over and over again, because if they're telling it so much, if they're going and spending this much time on it, they have to be going deeper. They can't just be saying the story over and over again, right? They've got to be looking at it in different ways. They have to be delving into the implications, and that this is what we should do. And so that's exactly what you're all doing, right? Talking about generations and how you talk about this, and looking at COVID, and looking at Holocaust, and looking at how we relate to this and the implications of this story in new ways. This is Passover, is what they're saying. This is what you do. This is how we celebrate this holiday. Hold on, I'm scrolling, hold on.
Yeah, they're saying turn it and turn it, just like we do with the Torah, turn it and turn it.
Keep turning, you're gonna find something. You're gonna find something. I'm looking, hold on, I'm trying to find which one it's in. All right, I can't find what I'm looking for, but this is their point here. So whether or not your Seder goes all night long, I think is not necessarily what we're talking about, right? I'm not anticipating that probably any of you are going to say have a Seder until the sun comes up in the morning. Unless someone tell me that I'm wrong. If that's your intention, I'm happy to hear it. If you're going to, rage all night on this Seder, all the power to you. I will be sleeping. I'll be in bed by 10, but you have at it. That's going to bring you joy. But how could we embody this tradition, even if we're not staying up all night, right? What are things, concrete things that we could do this Passover to honor this idea?
Create community, I guess. To bring people together the best way we can.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the ways to honor.
And invite different people to your Seder.
For sure.
I can't help but wonder what the Seder has no call to action. The Seder is about an action that's already taken place.
Yeah, that's true.
And about reminiscing the past, looking and helping us to guide us into the future. And we spend a tremendous amount of money on getting the special foods, creating the special meal, and doing all those things. What if instead, I just got your email about looking into food insecurities. What if in place of kind of recreating normal eating during Passover, we ate simply on Passover, during Passover, and donated that money to people who don't have the wherewithal to buy food? That we operate a little bit differently and think beyond ourselves. Because what I keep on thinking as we talk about this, to sit and pray all night means that you have the resources to do that. You have the ability to not have to have any other obligations all that night or the next day because it's a holiday. Anyway, that's where I am right this moment.
I love that idea, right? That is taking this story and turning it, right? That's looking at the implications of this story. It's exactly what we're looking to do, right? How do I take this story and how do I feel like I'm a part of it? How does that fit in my world? And we need to look at it through our lens, right? We should look contextually as well. But how do I pick up this tradition of these 5 rabbis sitting in a room saying this story all night? And I think that's a beautiful way to do it. I think it's a great idea. You know, they make all these, when I grew up, my parents would start buying like they make kosher for Passover cereal, and they make kosher for Passover this and that and that. And at some point, we started to look around at each other. And as an adult, I certainly said, I don't know, that's the point, right? I'm not trying, I want to feel, Passover is not about deprivation, right? The eating, which I talk about a lot with people, the eating tradition of Passover is not about deprivation. It's about feeling and marking something as different. And my parents actually, when my brother was in high school, and he started to really, he was a teenager and a football player who was consumed an extraordinary number of calories and ate all kinds of crazy stuff and hated Passover. He came to hate it because it felt so restrictive and felt like it was just annoying what he was eating. And so my parents started instituting Passover traditions that made it not feel like deprivation, because it wasn't the point. They would have a Passover night where they had steaks, just like huge steaks the size of their head, right?
Rabbi?
So that's kosher eating, kosher Passover eating, but it's not about sort of shifting it into this wrong place. I mean, this is what happens with our traditions if we don't watch it, if we don't think critically about it. We start to take it to a place where we aren't honoring the idea, where we're eating, they're terrible, the kosher Passover cereal, if you've ever tried it. Ugh. But we're eating this box of cereal instead of honoring the holiday, right? We're not there. And so this is how we make sure that our, not only are we celebrating in relevant ways to our lives, but that we're actually honoring the original intention, is by examining our practices this way. Alan, yes.
A perfect example for what Janet said was the movie, which some of us have seen, Keeping Up with the Steins. And Janet knows Jim Gutman. We were talking about dressing up for temple, and Jim said to me, there's some people that can't afford it. And I'll never forget it.
Absolutely. It's a great parallel. If you haven't seen Keeping Up with the Steins, that's a must. So is Keeping the Faith. That's another one you have to see too. Very different movies, but very good. Yeah, Mark.
See if we can stretch this out a little bit. What relationship does the fact that for Purim, you're supposed to give money for poor people to eat, and then on Passover, you're supposed to invite them to your house to eat?
I mean, to me, it's different permutations of the same idea, right? I mean, we're trying to honor the same idea and fulfill the same intention.
Why did they put them a month apart? Why is Purim so close to Passover?
I mean, that's largely about other calendar concerns. But with Passover, we have something to invite someone to. Purim isn't quite the same in that we don't have, Purim is supposed to have a festive meal, but it's not the same kind of event kind of moment that we can invite someone in for Passover. And Passover, we speak more personally about Passover. Passover is a deeply personal holiday, right? To feel that I myself was taken out of Egypt. And so to invite someone to your Passover table, to me, I think is a much more personal act than inviting them to a Purim meal. I think that's a different kind of offer. And I think Passover and the idea of the holiday demands that we do something different. I love what Marshall put in the chat here. This helps to develop our Jewish soul, as do our prayers. The lesson is Lador Vador. I mean, at the end of the day, I love that what we're doing, we're working to develop our Jewish souls. And that's the ultimate goal. And so how can we pick up new intentions, new practices, new rituals, or pick up old rituals, whatever it may be, with this aim of developing our Jewish soul, enhanced by what we learned from our tradition, right? So how could picking up the tradition of these 5 men telling the story all night long develop our Jewish souls? How could we honor that tradition in a way that feeds our souls and feeds the souls of the generation after us? to pick up on this Lador Bador.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
I was going to say that I noticed a Christian or a couple, but they're into Judaism, and I invited them to Passover Seder. And boy, they were into it. They just appreciated that.
Absolutely. Hold on. I'm grabbing a book off my shelf. I'm grabbing something. I'm going to tell you. So at the end of it, and we talked a little bit about this at the very beginning, that we say next year in Jerusalem, and that can look like a lot of different things, just about feeding your soul. And what I always think about when we talk about it is this Haggadah I have that's a collection. It's the traditional text, but all of the pages are done by different Israeli artists. They're all in really different styles. It's super cool. And this is the final page. It's an El Al plain and a bowl of chicken soup. That's next year in Jerusalem. I love it. And so whatever your next year in Jerusalem, I'm not back with you until after Passover. So whatever your next year in Jerusalem looks like, whatever that piece of something better is really about the hope, right? So whether that's we believe in a messianic age coming by next year, or we believe in a post-COVID age coming next year, that we hope next year will be better, that we'll have a little taste of something that's better than the taste we had this year. And so that is my wish and my hope for all of you, is that next year in Jerusalem, it means something a little better for each of us, whatever you need it to be. And, at minimum, until then, we'll keep studying together. We'll keep learning. And I think I'm learning with a number of you tonight for Women's Torah Study. It's our kickoff. You're going to get an email this afternoon from me. We have 50 people registered to study together tonight. Yeah, it's awesome. So we're gonna keep learning. But thanks for learning with me this afternoon in the meantime. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
You.
Thank you.
Thank you.